It's something of a cliche to reference George Orwell, but sometimes it's essential. And the reason it's a cliche is because he's just so damn good. And here he is, in 1984, his most important and best known work. Every statue and street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And the process is continuing, day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. It's unfortunate that, at the minute, a large body of people have decided to interpret 1984 not as a dire warning of a future dystopia, but as a guidebook for the here and now. There are quite a lot of people in the world I have little time for, but the ones I have least time for are those who want to whitewash history and destroy art. These narcissistic fools are arrogant enough to think they can unilaterally impose their views on the wider population in the public space. But they're emulating the Puritans of the 17th century, the Jacobins of revolutionary France, the Stalinists, Maoists, Nazis, and Khmer Rouge of the 20th century, and ISIS of rather more recent vintage. These are perhaps not the sort of people you should really be looking to for inspiration. And a few things need to be made clear to these individuals, because bad things have happened in the past, and every single nation and civilization there has ever been was founded on slavery. But what distinguishes Western society is that we were the first civilization to end slavery, a point that isn't discussed much. It's also important to point out that you can't impose 21st century views on historical figures. In fact, trying to impose modern standards on vanished centuries is the single most ahistorical thing you can do. Historical figures did not hold contemporary views. This does not mean that they should be extinguished from the current realm. More to the point, in the period in which these people were operating, the entire economy was wrapped up in slavery. So if you were involved in business at the time, it was virtually impossible to avoid associations with slavery in some form if you reached any sort of fiscal level. Shipping, cotton, sugar, coffee, and all their attendant industries were interlocked and interdependent. These activists are basically judging people simply for being alive at the time. But their position's also terribly inconsistent. After all, Muhammad was a slave trader. So if we're to demolish monuments to slavers, to make sure that these figures are not celebrated, we should be pulling down all the mosques as well. Americans should be taking down the statues of Washington and Jefferson. And in Rome, they should be toppling every statue raised to Caesar and Augustus, along with the Parthenon and the Colosseum. It seems odd that some slaves must go, but others are absolutely welcome to stay. And that's because the people responsible for this, a tiny, radical clique conceited enough to think that they alone can determine the public space, are simply historically illiterate. They don't actually care about this issue. Or else they might try tackling the actually existing slavery that scars Africa to this day. But all they really care about is advertising their virtue, while hurling abuse at anyone who suggests caution. Some people have made comparisons to those who tore down statues in past communist states, or in Iraq. Well, let's make that comparison, shall we? Because on one hand, you have individuals acting in the heat of violent revolution. And on the other hand, you have people living in stable, prosperous societies, arbitrarily deciding to get incredibly furious about something that happened 300 years ago. So there's no kind of correlation there at all. Now, don't be fooled by my dulcet tones. I'm first generation Irish, so if I was so inclined, I could scream for statues of Oliver Cromwell, Charles Trevelyan, and Edward Carson to be toppled, or for the Union Jack to be burnt. And I could certainly do so with more justification than white middle-class people in Bristol can for tearing down statues of slavers. But I'd be disgusted by such suggestions. And if anyone else called for them, if anyone else recommended such vandalism, I'd resist them with every fibre of my being. This brings us on to London's Mayor, Sadiq Khan. Now, Khan is a Muslim, and there's nothing wrong with that before you start. But it does mean that he's an individual who's devoted his entire life to worshipping a slave owner, who's now clamouring to tear down monuments to slave owners. London is a wonderful, magical, mesmerising place. But there are quite a high percentage of woke, self-righteous idiots there right now, all singing from the same songbook. And Khan is their totemic chief. London is twice as old as Baghdad and Cairo. It's a treasure trove of history. And it's far too important to be left to the whims of such historically illiterate, cultural vandals. Because if they're not stopped, this orgy of destruction will not sate them. It will only encourage them. Now, I immediately assumed that they'd move their target onto their own interpretation of militarism and colonialism. That they'd clamour for the annihilation of Nelson, Wellington and Churchill. But in fact, they've already moved on to their next target. And it's, the Cub Scouts. They want to pull down Robert Baden-Powell now. Because apparently he was a homophobe. That's crazy. You'd almost think that when he was alive, homosexuality was a criminal offence or something. All of this mania really illustrates the emptiness of the modern left. Because if you have to go back a few centuries to find something to get furious about, then you really don't have a point. Those leading this campaign have no argument. Just petulance, arrogance, and ignorance. And they must be stopped. They're an endlessly noisy and bullying contingent. But they are a very small minority. A minority who despise this country and the vast majority who love it. And we must now draw a line in the sand. We must inform these people that they do not get to determine the public space that is shared by us all. So I'd like to conclude by recalling the wisdom of Edmund Burke. Because half a dozen grasshoppers under a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle, reposed beneath the shadow of the British oak, chew the cud and are silent, pray do not imagine that those who make the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. The woke crusaders, who have such contempt for our nation and history, are loud indeed. But we outnumber them, and we need to remember that as the fight back continues. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe, and if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.